My name is Maria Gonzalez, and I'm here to discuss the first part of Chapter 15. So, what is parasitism? Parasitism is a symbiotic relationship between individuals of two species in which one, the parasite, benefits from the association, and the other, the host, is harmed. A heavy load of parasites are labeled as an infection, and the outcome of said infection is usually a disease. Parasites are categorized based on size. Microparasites, which include viruses, bacteria, and protists, are small in size and have a short generation time. They develop and multiply rapidly within the host, and they also cause disease commonly found in denser populations. Though an upside is that they have the ability to cause immunity for the host. Microparasites, on the other hand, are relatively large. Some examples include worms, insects, and fungi. Macroparasites take quite a long time to generate and typically do not complete their entire life cycle within a single host organism. Because parasites benefit from the symbiotic relationship, they gain access to the available resources provided by the host. Hemiparasites are photosynthetic plants that are able to produce food for themselves. They only get water from their hosts. Holoparasites are parasitic plants that are not able to photosynthesize, and thus function as heterotrophs. They rely totally on the host for essential needs. Hosts are habitats, where many parasites are specialized to live at certain sites and exploit every conceivable location. Parasites that live on the host's skin, within the protective cover of feathers and hair, are ectoparasites. Others are known as endoparasites, which live within the host. Endoparasites, which gain entrance to and escape from the host within their life cycle, can enter and exit host animals through various pathways. They travel to their point of infection through the pulmonary, circulatory, or digestive systems of their host. Parasites must escape from one host and locate to another, which is something that they can only do during their infective stage of their life cycle. Now, how do parasites locate from one host to the other? They do this through either direct or indirect transmission. The process of direct transmission occurs either through direct physical contact or through the air, water, or any other substrate. Microparasites are more often transmitted directly, while macroparasites are also able to but are less inclined to. Some parasites are transmitted between hosts by means of a whole other organism that we call vectors. These carriers become intermediate hosts where parasites are able to develop into a specific stage in their life cycle before infecting a different host.
Transmission can involve multiple hosts and stages, so some species of parasite cannot complete their entire life cycle unless they go through multiple hosts. The definitive host, which harbors the adult stage of the parasite, or this is where the parasite reaches its maturity. Intermediate host, where it harbors the developmental stages of the parasite. So these parasites cannot develop to the next stage if they are not properly transmitted to the appropriate host. So the populations of the parasite is highly dependent on the host interactions and populations. So this is the meaning gelworm. Its intermediate host is the snail, and the definitive host is the deer. After ingestion of an infected snail, the worm will travel to the deer's brain membrane, where it will reach its maturity, mate, and reproduce. The eggs will then escape through the lungs and be coughed up and consequently swallowed, and pass through as part of the feces, so it can encounter another snail to infect again. This portion will be discussing the defense mechanism adapted by the host to combat the parasites. The first adaptation is behavioral, in the form of mammals by grooming and birds in preening. If infected, the first line of defense is inflammatory response. In animals, the formation of scabs to reduce further entry of the parasite, and cysts in the muscle or skin to isolate the parasite. In plants, the formation of cysts in the roots and scabs in the fruits and roots. Gall formation to expose larvae to predation. Second line of defense, the immune system. Production of antibodies by the lymphocytes. These antibodies attaches to the parasite's surface, which impairs their movement, reproduction, and feeding. Failure of the immune system, which results to chronic infection. Poor nutrition leads to parasites becoming more pathogenic. These antibodies are made up of proteins. If you have protein deficiency, you will not make enough antibodies. Breakdown of the immune system, which is caused by HIV. HIV targets specifically the immune cells themselves, so it will break down the immune system itself. The consequences of the parasite stealing resources from the host, which reduces the host reproduction and growth. Examples of these are in the reduction of the fat storage in the female fence lizards. These lizards are infected with malaria, which had lower clutch size than uninfected ones. Reduction in the carotenoids in the zebrafinch beaks. Behavioral changes in the rabbits infected with tularemia. These are infected with tularemia These are uninfected with tularemia, which the infected ones had considerably higher conspicuous behaviors, and the killifish infected with nematodes behaved unnaturally, which made them more likely to be eaten by birds.
Natural selection has resulted in the level of immune response in which the metabolic resources by the host can minimize the impact of parasitism, but does not weaken its own growth and reproduction. However, natural selection does not necessarily favor peaceful coexistence between the host and parasites. And since parasites will not gain any advantage if it kills its host, so to maximize fitness, a parasite should balance the trade-off between its virulence and other components of the fitness in order to benefit in the relationship. And because of natural selection, parasitism can evolve into a mutually beneficial relationship. Host species have evolved a variety of defenses to minimize the impact of parasites' presence. And there are situations in which the hosts have adapted and countered the negative effects of the parasite, and that relationship may be termed as commensalism. And we all know that commensalism is a relationship between two species in which one benefits while the other is unaffected or not harmed. So in this example, this is a remora which attaches itself to a shark, and a remora gains an advantage to avoid being a prey, while the shark gains no benefit from this relationship. So that is commensalism. And at some stage in host parasite coevolution, the relationship may become beneficial to both species. A host tolerant of parasitic infection may begin to exploit the relationship. And at that point, the relationship is termed as mutualism. So this is an example of mutualism. And another example where the parasitic relationship became a mutualistic relationship is when rats became infected with this tapeworm at their intermediate stage. Rats grows larger than uninfected rats do because the tapeworm larva produces growth hormones. So the rat exploited the relationship, the parasitic relationship. Mutualism is a relationship between two members of the species benefiting from one another, but evidence suggests that often this interaction is more of a reciprocal exploitation rather than a cooperative effort between individuals. And mutualism can be characterized by a number of variables. First is the benefits received, the degree of dependency, degree of specificity, duration of intimacy. Benefits may include provision of essential resources such as nutrients, shelter, or also protection. Mutualism also varies on how much the species involved in the mutualistic interaction depend on each other. So that is the degree of dependency. So it has two types, the obligate mutualist and the facultative mutualist. The degree of specificity of mutualism also varies from one interaction to another. It could be species specific associations or one to one, that is called a specialist, or it could also be association with a wide diversity of mutualistic partners, and that is called as generalist. And lastly, some mutualists are symbiotic, in which individuals coexist and their relationship is more obligatory, whereas others are free living or non-symbiotic.
Now, let's discuss about the importance of mutualism. Mutualisms are involved in the transfer of nutrients. It helps in digestion of plant materials and in nutrient uptake. Microbes found in the ruminant's gut helps the ruminant by digesting cellulose. In return, ruminant supplies nutrients and suitable environment to the microbes. Rhizobium bacteria helps plants for nutrient uptake by reducing nitrogen to ammonia so that legumes can receive fixed nitrogen. Also, mycorrhizal fungi help plants for their nutrient uptake. Then these fungi and bacteria receive a supply of carbon and other resources. Some mutualisms are defensive to protect the plants and to get rid of parasites through cleaning. Fungi helps plants from herbivores by producing alkaloid compounds, which is toxic to herbivorous animals. In return, these plants provide food in the form of photosynthetics to fungi. Another example is this ant species. It protects the tree from herbivores. Then, the tree provides food and shelter to these ants. There are organisms that remove parasites living on another organism by feeding on these parasites. A study conducted by John Stokowicz shows the importance of mutualism in these organisms, crab and corals. In well-lit habitats, the growth of corals are reduced as seaweeds grow on it, which can result to their death. He hypothesized that these species of coral are able to grow in well-lit habitats because of this species of crab. He conducted field experiments and it shows that the crab protects the coral from overgrowth by seaweeds and the coral provides shelter to protect the crab.
In this section, we will be able to learn how plants evolved to deter herbivores. Some plants evolved forming defenses against the herbivores. Some of them developed thorns and spines, while others had hairy leaves. This is what you can see in this slide. These additional features of plants are the structural defenses which developed over time. Most plant features are relatively low in quality, and herbivores that have to live on such resources suffer high mortality or reproductive failure. Other than the structural defenses, some plants contain chemicals that can do harm to animal predators, and some of these chemicals are known as secondary compounds. They can either reduce the ability of herbivores to digest plant tissues or deter herbivores from feeding. Now, we can classify this into three major classes. First is the nitrogen-based compounds which contain the alkaloids such as morphine, atropine, nicotine, and cyanide. Second are the terpenoids, which include a variety of essential oils like latex and plant resins. And then the third one, which is the phenolics, which contains the aromatic compounds including the tannins and the lignins. In terms of the quantities produced and toxicity level of secondary compounds, we can further classify these into two types of inhibitors, the quantitative inhibitors and the qualitative inhibitors. Now, when we say quantitative inhibitors, these are compounds produced at large quantities, whereas qualitative inhibitors, these are compounds produced at minute quantities. So in terms of toxicity level, qualitative inhibitors is more toxic than quantitative inhibitors. Qualitative inhibitors are toxic at minimum level, whereas quantitative inhibitors, they only reduce the digestibility and potential energy gain of the herbivores. As you can see in this slide, one among the unique ways of plants in deterring herbivores is by signaling animals to call for help. This is through attracting the predators of their predators. Parasitic and predatory arthropods often prevent plants from being severely damaged by killing herbivores as they feed on the plants. So the signaling role probably evolved secondarily from plant responses that produce toxins and deterrents against herbivores. In sum, all three, plants, herbivores, and carnivores, are interrelated. Now, ecologists are beginning to understand these three-way relationships. Plant herbivore and herbivore-carnivore systems are closely related. An example of three-level feeding interaction is the cycle of vegetation, hares, and their predators, as you can see in this image. Malnourished hares are falling quickly to predators, and recovery of hares follows recovery of plants and decline in predators. Besides influencing prey population directly through mortality, Predators can cause changes in prey characteristics by inducing defense responses in prey morphology, physiology, or behavior. Reduced activity by prey in the presence of predators can reduce foraging time and food intake, subsequently delaying growth and development. The net result can be a reduction in the growth rate of the prey population.
So to fully understand the mutualistic interactions between two species, I will be showing you a representation model in the concept of quantifying ecology. So the simplest model of a mutualistic interaction between two competing species is similar to the basic Lotka-Volterra model. So this model describes a facultative rather than obligate interaction because the carrying capacities of the two species are positive and each species, basically in the population, can grow in the absence of the other. So now let's proceed on the ecological issues and applications. So the expansion of agriculture and urbanization by means of cutting and clearing of forests has long been associated with declining and the reduction of biological diversity resulting from habitat loss. However, recent study shows that these land use changes are resulting in an expansion of infectious diseases impacting human health. So forest clearing has altered the abundance or dispersal of pathogens, which primarily causing disease in the host organisms that influence the abundance and distribution of animal species that function as their hosts and vectors. So forest clearing has had a similar impact on the rise of vector-borne infectious disease in the tropical regions. So the term vector-borne infectious disease here is a disease infection transmitted to humans and other animals, including arthropods. Examples of these are the mosquitoes, ticks, and the fleas. So examples of these vector-borne infectious diseases are the following: the dengue fever, the West Nile virus, Lyme disease, and the malaria, but we will be focusing on these two. So one of the best documented cases of forest clearing impacting the transmission of an infectious disease involves the Lyme disease. So it is an infectious disease that contracts 300,000 people each year, primarily in the Northeast. So it is caused by this particular bacterial parasite, which is actually transmitted by the bite of an infected black-legged tick. So this image here shows a 4-stage life cycle of a tick. So when these larval ticks hatch, they are actually uninfected. But when they are fed on blood, particularly on an organism infected by these particular bacterial parasite, they become infected and the bacteria is then transmitted to the people. So larval ticks feed on a wide variety of host species that carry the bacterial parasite. These are the birds, reptiles, and the mammals. But to take note, not all host species are equally likely to transmit the infection to the feeding tick. So human activities in the northeastern United States have resulted in the fragmentation of what was once a predominantly forested landscape. So the term fragmentation here involves both a reduction in the total forested area as well as a reduction in the average size of remaining forest patches. So the key consequence of fragmentation here is that there will be a reduction in terms of the species diversity. However, there are certain species actually thrive in highly fragmented landscape. And one example of this species is the white-footed mouse. So the white-footed mouse actually reach unusually high densities in small forest fragments, which actually results in a decreased abundance of both predators and competitors. But the real question is, Could forest fragmentation and associated increases in the populations of white-footed mice in the northeast be responsible for the increased transmission of Lyme disease in this region? So to answer that, some researchers actually conducted a study in which they examined the impact of forest clearing and fragmentation in southeastern New York State on the potential for transmission of Lyme disease. So they hypothesized that the small forest patches have a higher density of infected nymphal black-legged ticks than larger patches. So they tested this hypothesis and they found both an exponential decline in the density of nymphal ticks as well as a significant decline in the nymphal infection prevalence with increasing size of forest patches. So in conclusion, there was a dramatic increase in the density of infected nymphs and therefore in Lyme disease risk with decreasing size of forest patches. So an additional factor resulting from forest clearing and fragmentation in the region is an increase in the population of white-tailed deer, which is actually the primary host species for the adult ticks. So together, the increases in white-footed mice and white-tailed deer population in the northeast that have resulted from alterations of the landscape have dramatically increased the populations of ticks and the transmission rate of the bacterial pathogen that causes the Lyme disease. So now let's proceed on the malaria. So deforestation in the Amazon rainforest has been linked to an increase in the prevalence of malaria. So a similar research study was conducted, after which the researchers found that after adjusting for population, a 4.3% increase in deforestation between 1997 and 2000 was associated with a 48% increase in malaria risk. So, to end this slide, the impacts of forest clearing in changing land use patterns are not limited to the enhancement of pathogen populations and their vectors. So the result has been the emergence of new parasites and associated diseases, which also has the potential for changes in the distribution of pathogens and their vectors as a result of changing climate conditions.